Hello, my name is Alicia, and welcome to my Unnoticed Evil channel. And so in this channel, I'm going to be talking about certain behaviors and certain ways of thinking that are harmful, but that we may not think very much of. Now, evil does not always have the direct goal of doing harm. It may also be, well, I want to get whatever I want, and I don't care who gets harmed in the process. And so today, I'm going to be talking about evil's aversion to objective reality. Now, evil thrives in an environment where there's really no known objective reality, where everything is just a matter of opinions and feelings. And so, in certain contexts, objective reality can actually be evil's enemy. For one thing, objective reality can reveal how horrible evil behaviors really are, and people don't want us to know how terrible their behaviors are. They would rather do what they want and nobody think much of it. Now, sometimes objective reality can conflict with the evildoer's agenda. A classic example could be for the tobacco industry, which wants to sell their product and make money. Well, in objective reality, tobacco products are actually bad for us, and it's not in our better interest for us to consume them. Therefore, objective reality in that sense conflicts with the agenda of the tobacco industry, and that's why the tobacco industry has this incentive to manufacture its own reality, which says that tobacco products are actually not really that bad, and actually they just make us happy. And so now, generally speaking, when evildoers take something that should be objective and make it subjective, they get protection from accountability. And so with subjectivity, there's really no right or wrong. And so in effect, subjectivity can be like a weapon that the evildoer may use against the voice that is trying to speak out against it and seek justice. And so, in certain contexts, evildoers can try to take something that should be objective and to make it subjective, and this can impede the ability of a victim to seek justice. For example, let us say that the victim has been wronged and tries to confront the perpetrator. The perpetrator may use certain language like, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. Tell me more about how you are feeling. Well, now that you put it that way, well, I never thought of it that way. Now, these kinds of words maybe are words that can seem rather innocuous at first glance, but that in actuality can really pierce the soul. Because what that little word feel says is it's all in your head. It's not really objectively real. It's just a feeling. And so this can, in effect, reduce the credibility of the victim's testimony. It can be like a form of gaslighting. That little word feel, it's kind of a facade of being sensitive to the person's emotions, but in reality is really code for it's all in your head. Now, granted, sometimes people can feel victimized for the wrong reasons. There is such a thing as unrighteous anger, but we're not talking about that here. So, what evildoers sometimes like to do is they sometimes like to portray the negative emotion as being its own independent entity. They don't want to necessarily address the stimulus or acknowledge the stimulus that warranted that negative emotion. They would rather have us think that this negative emotion just exists by itself. All we need to do is soothe the victim, make him or her feel better. They don't want to admit that this negative emotion actually has a stimulus that warranted it, in particular the evildoer's wrongdoings. Now, it could be even worse for the victim if the victim perchance has a history of mental illness or bad moods. Then, the evildoer can take whatever negative emotional response the victim has to the evildoer's wrongdoings and attribute it to the victim's diagnosable defect. And so, now if you find sometimes that you're trying to question your view of reality, you're trying to constantly have to reassure yourself that you have your head on straight, it's possible that somebody may be trying to mess with your head who has bad intentions. Now, another context where subjectivity can be harmful is when we're interpreting a set of messages. You may have heard the expression, it all depends on how you interpret it. And this expression we may not think much of, but it can have very serious implications. What it basically says is the writer of the message no longer defines the message, but rather the reader. And this can be bad because it can strip the writer of self-expression. Now, for those of you who follow the Bible, and you hear the term, it all depends on how you interpret it, what that basically says is that God no longer defines the message, but rather us. But of course, that's not true. God's intended message is God's intended message is God's intended message. And so we are either interpreting the Bible correctly or we are not. And now granted, some parts of the Bible are hard to read and interpret, but it still is the same message regardless of how we read it. Now, another context where subjectivity can be harmful is moral relativism. Moral relativism is the mindset that right and wrong is subjective, and that my right and wrong is just as good as your right and wrong, and we should all just accept each other's idea of right and wrong. And so this can seem nice and all-inclusive, but it can have very harmful implications once again. It essentially grants permission to evildoers to inflict whatever harm on innocent people they want and simply call it right. And granted, no matter how heinous the behavior is, no matter how heinous the deeds are, there's always some rationalization or justification you can use to make it look like it's right. Even during the Holocaust, when the Nazis were trying to annihilate the entire Jewish population in brutal concentration camps, they found justifications for doing these things. They thought they were making the world a better place by genetic cleansing. And certainly, wouldn't we be happier if we had good genes? And so, are you a moral relativist? Well, if you say you are a moral relativist, but you still say the Holocaust was objectively wrong, you are contradicting yourself, because moral relativism in its true form says that nothing is objectively wrong. Now, some people may identify as being partially moral relativist, meaning maybe they will acknowledge some things as being objectively right or wrong, but other things maybe not. But we should be warned that if we are moral relativist to any extent, we are leaving some room for tolerance for potentially harmful behaviors. And so the more morally relativist we get, the more atrocity we may be made to tolerate so long as somebody somewhere calls it right. Now, then there's another context where, let's say, there's subjectivity when it comes to evaluating disputes. There sometimes is the blanket assumption that both sides are always equal and or equally at fault. And so this I call fake impartiality, or in the context of journalism, maybe called false balance. And so when we go and assume that both sides are equally right and equally at fault, it can look impartial. But it really does is it really renders the victim unable to assert a harm done against him or her. And because, after all, it's just the word of one party against the word of the other party. And so if the victim tries to acknowledge any harm done against him or her, then they could just be told, well, every side thinks it's right. Every side thinks that it's the victim. So what does it matter what you say? Your perpetrator will probably say something else. And so, of course, this kind of false balance or fake impartiality always lays partial responsibility onto the victim. Now, true impartiality always tries to collect the facts about what happened and who did what wrong. And, of course, there are plenty of cases where there's going to be some wrong on both sides. But some cases, when we collect the facts, we may find that one side's more the victim, the other side's more the perpetrator. And we don't want to lay partial responsibility on the victim. Now, one, of course, example is, let's say there are some neighbors who like to play loud music. Some people think these are just two, and then, your neighbors who like to have peace and quiet. Some people may think these are just two sides that are just have differences, and they're just not having a dispute. But what we see here is that one side is more the victim, and the other side is more the perpetrator. But of course, if the people who want quiet try to assert a wrong done against them, they may be told, well, maybe if you were the one playing the music, maybe we wouldn't mind. So this is what I call assumed partiality of the victim, where the victim is accused of being partial against a certain behavior just because they were the victim. Of course, the way that I see it is this is the equivalent of saying, well, you just think racism is wrong because you're black. Or, well, you just think sexual harassment is wrong because you're a woman. Now, granted, we would not really say these things, and there's a reason for that. Because most people, if not all people, acknowledge that racism is objectively wrong and that sexual harassment is wrong. However, people don't always want to admit that playing loud music for other people to hear is wrong. But there is a real victimization taking place. After all, the need to play loud music does not exist. It's really just a luxury. However, when people hear loud music that they don't want to hear, it can disrupt their inner peace, it can disrupt their ability to sleep, and that can really cause harm to people. Now, sometimes there is a known objective reality, and even in those cases, evildoers like to do what's called manufactured uncertainty. Manufactured uncertainty is when people with wicked intentions like to take something that should be certain, but then make it sound like it's more uncertain. And so, public health is especially affected. For example, the tobacco industry liked to manufacture uncertainty regarding the health dangers of consuming their products. They even said, doubt is in their product. The oil and gas industry also liked to manufacture uncertainty regarding whether or not there is climate change, despite widespread scientific consensus that there is climate change and that the Industrial Revolution was a significant factor. So, in effect, manufactured uncertainty can be an instrument for evil that evildoers sometimes use to conceal the destructive effects of their actions. It creates confusion among bystanders that is not meant to be there. It enables evildoers to evade accountability for the consequences of their actions. And in the case of the tobacco industry and the oil and gas industry, profits are allowed to flourish at the expense of public health. And so, because objective reality is often an enemy of evil, it can interfere with their agenda, it can reveal how horrible evil is. This is why evildoers like to lie so much. Lying allows the evildoer to manufacture their own reality to meet their own agenda. And so lying effectively diverts attention and awareness away from the objective truth, objective reality, and onto an alternate reality that has been manufactured to meet the corrupt agenda. And now sometimes people say, well, I'm just lying to protect somebody because I know the truth will hurt them. But you're really not acting in the person's better interest by telling the person what he or she wants to hear. Thomas Sowell once said, when you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And so that effectively is the truth when it comes to telling people what they want to hear versus the truth. You may think you're being nice to them by telling them what they want to hear and sparing their feelings, but you really just don't want to be the burden of bearing bad news. You'd like to be the bearer of good news because that's easier. And of course, if you bear the bad news, the person would be in a state of distress, and then the evildoer would have to show compassion, which they don't want to have to do. So they'd rather just give the false good news, see the person be happy, not have to show any compassion, and move on with their merry day. Now, then another context. When, let us say, we are evaluating somebody makes an accusation. The evildoer may evaluate the accusation based on who made the accusation, who is the target of the accusation, is the accusation made against me, is it made against somebody I like, and also, of course, how serious is the accusation. But what the evildoer does not care about as much is an accusation a true accusation? Now, of course, a good person would never want to make a false accusation. The good person, of course, would place top priority on how true the accusation is. Not the evildoer, however. They just want to get away with things, and if the accusation is made against them and it's a true accusation, they will not like that. However, if it's a false accusation, maybe made against somebody else, not really my friend, I don't care. And so, generally speaking, if the evildoer has a secret to hide, then objective reality becomes the enemy and a threat. And so, while good people may do some things that are wrong, the good person at least is open to taking accountability afterwards. Now, evildoers may hate objective reality, but they're more than happy to pretend that they want the truth. They may even project their hatred of the truth onto you or others, accusing others of not being able to handle the truth. And they may even pretend to adopt evidence-based thinking, but in reality are just cherry-picking the evidence, that basically selecting the evidence that goes best with what they want to believe, that meets their own chosen reality, and ignoring or tuning out the evidence that is against what they want to believe. So to summarize, evil generally favors subjectivity over objectivity. It thrives in an environment where evil is not defined. And of course, if evil is not objectively defined, we're letting evildoers define evil. And when they do that, they're never going to define themselves as being evil. It's always going to be something else. And so subjectivity essentially creates an environment where there is no right or wrong, up or down, left or right. And so, in effect, evil can flourish without accountability or scrutiny. Victims are left unable to rightfully assert the wrongs done against them. Justice is diminished and psychological harm is magnified.